So I've been talking yesterday about the central institutions, the core institutions of our Triratna Buddhist movement, which we called semi-monastic institutions. So the communities, the businesses, and of course the centres, which enable this centre to be so vibrant and thriving. And I want to explore a little bit more what function they perform and what significance they have for each and every one of us. So in order to do that, I need to bring our attention to the Buddha himself, because this whole enterprise derives from and is focused upon the Buddha, that human individual who lived 2,500 years ago in northeast India, and according to Buddhist tradition, gained enlightenment at a place called Bodh Gaya in Bihar state now. So if we have an idea of the Buddha and what he was like, what he became through his efforts, through his enlightenment, we've got then some perspective on what we are doing and what these institutions mean, what they serve. And we've got some idea of how we ourselves might take forward the principles that lie behind them, whether we involve with those institutions or not. So I don't know what relationship each of you has to the Buddha. Maybe some of you only know of him, through a bit of reading or whatever. I know that in schools these days, my goodness, people learn about the Buddha, but it may not evoke much connection for you. I remember myself, my own very first connection with the Buddha. I had the misfortune to study philosophy in London. I studied it because we were given a reading list of the last days of Socrates. For those of you who know Plato, the Phaedo, the Crito, and the Apology. And reading about Socrates deeply inspired me. I felt this is a man I want to be like, I want to be influenced by, I want to engage with. And I enthusiastically studied philosophy, and in a way, it was pretty much a descent from that point. Obviously, some might argue with me. I wasn't so much, I think, interested in logic chopping, which was what philosophy was at that time. It was very much connected with analytic philosophy, which was a bad version of Wittgenstein. Yes, what I was really looking for was a living example, a teacher. Not just a teacher in a sort of more immediate sense, but a teacher who had experienced the heights of human possibility. So one day I awakened to the fact that Christianity did not exhaust religion, and I went out and I brought all the scriptures that I could find. I bought the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, Upanishads, Quran, I Ching, Tao Te Ching, etc., and a few others too. And amongst them I bought a book of Buddhist scriptures by Edward Conzer, published by Penguin. I think it's no longer in currency. I think they've got a new translation. It was a collection of Buddhist scriptures, and it starts with a life of the Buddha. And as I read the life of the Buddha from ancient sources, I began to experience this is what I was looking for. This is what I saw in Socrates, but here it is much more fully expressed. And I felt I sort of understood, I knew the individual that lay behind it to the extent that I could. It wasn't merely a story, it wasn't merely teachings. I felt I connected with a living individual, at least on some level, imaginatively, let's say. I don't want to overblow it. And what I experienced was an individual who was completely without attachment. He was completely without longing, without, you could say, desire. Of course, he felt hungry, in which case he ate. But he was not, in Maitreya Bandhu's words in the interval, he was not sort of bound up with the world. He was completely detached. He didn't feel a craving for anything. He didn't feel incomplete. He felt whole. He felt full, as it were, as an individual, psychically full. And yes, completely free of all that sort of longing that tugs so often at us. And it wasn't that he was sort of emotionally dead, because you can reach a state of sort of desirelessness, which is just exhaustion, or even depression, you could say. We just don't want anything because you're severely disappointed with life. It wasn't disgruntlement with the world. It was a complete detachment from the world. The world no longer really held him. And he enjoyed that state because he experienced something much richer, much more full, much deeper. He experienced deep happiness, which was unshakable. He was fully in tune with all life. He was full of compassion, full of love, you could say. He felt no animosity, nothing that presented him with antagonism, no polarization. Our lives are so much lived amidst polarities, not this, that, not that, this against that, and so forth. He was free from that and extraordinarily energetic. We don't know exactly how old he was, but he was probably in his 80s when he died. And right up until the end, he travelled on foot throughout northeast India, talking to people about how they could experience what he experienced. So that's the baseline of our whole tradition. That's why we're all gathered here, because of what he experienced, this state of remarkable, blissful detachment and ease and harmony, in tune with everything. Constantly meeting people. He could be pretty direct with people, but always in a very loving way. He could meet people who were quite antagonistic, and he was not just a pushover. He would meet them head on and often get through to them. A remarkable picture, which you can read in the Pali scriptures. They're a little bit strange because they're written down to about 500 years after the Buddha himself died, and in a form that is suitable for recitation. So they don't make easy reading, but actually you can get quite a big picture, strong picture of the Buddha from reading those scriptures. You can sense the man behind them. And there are many quite good biographies in Buddhist tradition, like the one I was reading, which was the Buddha Charita by Asvaghosha, written in the 6th century, I think. A very lively, a very vivid portrait of a man who has triumphed, who's achieved what a human being can achieve, has freed himself from all suffering. Of course, he suffered physically, but all psychological, all existential suffering. He was completely free from that. But that did not mean he was a blank sort of emptiness. He was deeply compassionate, deeply engaged, extraordinarily skillful in his thought, and so on. A very, very powerful picture. So that is what we as Buddhists are committed to moving towards. I could even say become, but it seems a bit grandiloquent to sort of think of oneself as being like that. But that is what, as Buddhists, those of us who commit ourselves to the Buddhist path, that's what we're committed to. We're committed to becoming like the Buddha, to awakening like the Buddha, so that we no longer are subject to the winds of fortune. Life does not oppress us, and we experience a continuous state of inner tranquility, harmony, peace, and we feel in tune with all life. That's what Buddhism is focused upon. It's about trying to achieve that state. That's what this centre is about. It's about taking at least steps, early steps maybe, in that direction. And all our institutions are about bringing that about, insofar as they're healthy and alive, because institutions are institutions and sometimes they go off the rails. But that's what they're meant to be about, and by and large are about. They're about moving ourselves to the point at which we are no longer swayed by the winds of the world and find ourselves the deep equipoise. Nothing can disturb us, nothing can shake us. So, as I've said, the monastic, semi-monastic institutions that we have are aimed at taking us in that direction. So I want to break this down a little bit by looking at the different aspects of the Buddha's nature and seeing how those might play out in our own lives. The first thing is that the Buddha was removed from all craving. And of course, the biggest craving that we know is sex, the sex craving, the sexo-romantic craving. It's the biggest one. I think I can say from personal experience, and no doubt many of you will attest to it. Of course, there are other cravings which we also need to surmount, but that is what makes the world go round. And the Buddha had completely freed himself from that attachment, that craving. That didn't mean that he was cold and heartless, as I've stressed. I want to keep coming back to this. He was a man who could engage deeply with men and women of all kinds, all backgrounds, all castes and communities in India at that time, and help them to move towards the peace and tranquility and fulfillment that he enjoyed. So that's the first characteristic, this detachment, this freedom from craving, freedom from attachment, and especially freedom from the powerful cravings connected with the sexo-romantic complex, you could say. Then he was completely free from all craving for belongings. Didn't have a bank account. They did exist at that time, but he didn't have one. Buddhism is interesting, seems to have spread where the new sort of banking system began to develop. It's interesting, it also spread amongst the Greeks in northwest India, who were traders. It seems to have suited people who were a little bit free from the land, as it were, and who had a somewhat more cosmopolitan perspective. Anyway, be that as it may, the Buddha himself owned nothing. Traditionally, bhikshus, monks, nuns possess 5 or 8 things: 3 robes, a begging bowl, a water strainer, and a needle. Sometimes something else as well. But they own very, very little. Where there is any communal, any property, for instance, for a monastery or whatever, it's owned communally. So that the Buddha himself never even had a house. He never stayed anywhere for any length of time. He moved from place to place. And the aspiration was to be completely free from all worldly ties, to be completely free from all craving, not to need things in order to affirm one's identity. He was able to be free from all possessions and remain completely at ease, blissfully at ease. In fact, he rejoiced in not having anything. There's a very famous story in the Pali Canon where one of the Buddha's disciples, who'd previously been a king, joined the order and was practicing very intensely and was heard by others to be saying, "Ah, what bliss, what bliss." So some of them reported him to the Buddha. Yes, they were just like that. And they said to the Buddha, whatever his name is, I can't remember his name now, is imagining he's back in his palace and he's saying, "Ah, 'tis bliss, 'tis bliss." So the Buddha sent for him and asked him what was going on. And he said, "Well, actually, no, it's nothing to do with that. In fact, the very opposite. When I was a king, I had all those belongings. I had 7 walls around my palace. Guards slept at my door. Guards slept at the end of my bed. I lived in fear all the time. because I wanted to maintain my possessions. So I was remembering what that was like and thinking, now, without anything, what bliss, what bliss. So the Buddha was like that. He enjoyed freedom from craving. I've often told the story of a friend of mine who I went to IKEA with. And you know what IKEA is like. It's a cornucopia of well-designed Swedish minimalism and impossible flat packs. But we were going around, I needed to buy some bookshelves, I assure you. As we were going around, I noticed my friend, Sangadeva from Adhisthana, who's a gardener there, had a silly grin on his face. So I said, "Oh, seen something you like?" He said, "No, I'm enjoying the fact I don't want anything here." It's like we could see people walking around and the sort of, almost you could see a sort of vapour, a kind of fluid of desire coming off them towards this and that and that. Want, want, want. So Sangadeva was just enjoying the fact he didn't want any of it. And it wasn't just because he didn't like Swedish design. So the Buddha exemplified that to a very high degree, this freedom from any craving for possessions. He lived very, very simply. That's the third aspect we're going to look at. He lived very, very simply, just in the jungle. Of course, North India, at least outside the rainy season, is easy to live outdoors in particularly in the Mahavana. The whole of North India was covered by jungle. So the Buddha and his monks and nuns would wander from place to place, begging for alms, and they'd just sleep at the foot of trees. They'd sit for meditation much of the day, and they'd engage in discourse about the Dhamma. So a very, very simple, clean, pure sort of life, living very lightly on the land. During the winter season, during the monsoon season, which is very heavy, hopefully coming fairly shortly, because I'm going to India, and if it's not, the monsoon hasn't started, it's baking hot. It's 46 at the moment where I'm going to be going, so I hope that the monsoon comes and cools it all down. But of course, what happens in the Indian monsoon, it's really remarkable. It's like spring on steroids, English spring on steroids. It's amazing. You see things grow 2 feet overnight, and everything just springs into life. All the crabs come out, snakes come out, all sorts of other creepy crawlies, many of them come out, and the whole land crawls with life. So the Buddha realized that if they wandered during the rainy season, they would be destroying crops and they would be treading on creatures. So the idea was they settled for the 3 or 4 months of the monsoon, what's called the rainy season retreat, the Vasa. And during that period, they devoted themselves to meditation, lived a very, very even simpler life, just stationary in one place. And you know, we sometimes talk about them as monasteries. They weren't monasteries at all. They were usually parks, pleasure parks set aside by nobles or kings or whatever, just parks, like Victoria Park without the pavilion. Just open space with trees and etc. And they would just gather there, and they would go into the neighbouring village for food every day, begging food. As I mentioned yesterday, the tradition at that time was that if you were leading a spiritual life, a genuine renunciant life, the general population would support you. A bit like, you know, if you chose to practice the Dhamma here at the LBC, the government gave you a stipend. It's a good idea, isn't it? But I don't think it's going to happen. Not in this lifetime, anyway. So yes, the general populace valued people leading a serious spiritual life. It's interesting that there was that sense in the society as a whole that this was something valuable for everybody. If some people were leading that sort of life, it benefited the whole of society, which of course is true, but try telling that to people here today. So yes, a very, very simple life. The Buddha had no sort of ambition, nothing that he was personally trying to achieve. He didn't have a career, he didn't have a job. His only motive was communicating the Dhamma. He lived to help others to gain the sort of freedom that he had. And he lived that life communally. He lived it with others. He had friends around him. It's very obvious he was a very good friend, somebody who valued friendship very highly and who valued community. Most of the time we're presented with a picture of him living amidst quite a number of people. Sometimes they speak about wandering from town to village with 500 monks and nuns. It's probably hyperbole, but maybe it was 500. Yes, it was a communal life, a collective life that he lived. So this gives us 5 aspects of what we all can be working at from wherever we are, if we want to gain what the Buddha had achieved. If we want to become like the Buddha, we need to be working down these 5 avenues. The avenue of becoming free from craving, especially sex craving. We need to be working down the avenue of becoming free from attachment to possessions, becoming as much as we can free from possessions. Very difficult today. I found in the community in which I'm staying at the moment, I'm sorry to betray you like this, 4 different ways of making coffee. A number of machines that I presume will take you to the moon if you know how to operate. The simple life, lads. One bowl, one robe, one cappuccino. Yes, a life free from attachment, a very simple life. Maitreya Bandhu was mentioning the complexity of life today. It's not that it has to be complex. We sort of delight in the complexity. We engage ourselves with complexity. We almost court complexity, partly because it's stimulating. I think this is one of the great quests that we have, is for stimulation, because our lives are in many ways quite alienated. We're quite alienated, especially from nature, from the natural world around us. So we require stronger and stronger stimulus to keep us sort of enlivened. And we get that we've got the perfect economy for delivering stimulus at very low cost, well, the cost of your whole life, of course, but at very low immediate economic cost. You've got the machines that will deliver you instant distraction. Every now and again I have to take a vow of not looking at YouTube, because you start looking at something that is valuable to you, and before you know where it is, you've got a couple of minutes for this, a couple of minutes for that, a couple of minutes for that, and it's very good at catching you and drawing you in. And that's interesting. And I just have to take a vow. Don't go there. It's not actually beneficial. Sometimes it's useful to look at something, like talks from the LBC, of course. But you so easily get caught in distraction. You hear so much of conversations about distractions. Of course, sometimes it's more than that. So yes, a simple life. The Buddha lived an intensely simple life. And in that simple life, you can really be alive. You can be alive to what's happening now in you and around you. You can be much more alive to other people. And then we need to be devoting our lives to what is most important. Devoting our lives, if we possibly can, to the practice and sharing of the Dhamma. Devoting ourselves to serving the Dhamma, if we can relate to what that means. And we need a communal dimension to our lives, a collective dimension to our lives. So these 5 aspects are what make up the lines along which we need to be working. And they constitute the bases of what we've called the semi-monastic lifestyle, which is at the heart of the LBC and of our movement in general. Not that everybody is engaged with that all the time or in the same way. Some people participate in this way, some in that way. But all these institutions are based on these 5 principles. So I'm going to go through these one by one. And today I've got the most difficult one, and I've timed myself out because it is quite difficult to talk about. That's the first one, which is overcoming craving and attachment, and especially sex craving. In Buddhism, this is talked of in terms of, the word is Brahmacarya. Charya means faring or living or carrying on. It's related to the English word career. Brahma relates to a particular class of God. Now, cue for a little lesson in Buddhist cosmology. So Buddhism understands, and always has understood, the universe as being full of life. Life in many, many different forms, some of which, of course, we can see. We can see animals and insects and so forth. But there are many forms of life that most of us can't see. They're usually referred to in Buddhist tradition as devas, although there are other kinds that are more like, well, not demons, more like mischievous imps and that sort of thing. Yes, the word in Sanskrit and Pali is deva, in modern Indian languages too, which is usually translated as God. Of course, it doesn't mean God in the sense of the big G. It means these beings of a more subtle and refined nature who exist on higher planes of reality than our own, which intersect with ours, and through which we ourselves are capable of moving. It's possible for each and every one of us to have experiences of those different dimensions. Some people actually experience those beings. I have some friends who have that psychic ability and actually can see or can feel the presence of other beings. I'm personally blind in this sort of way. You can sort of feel something, but not really very clearly. But I certainly know people who I believe who are credibly able to perceive other beings, not on the material plane, as it were. So this is absolutely universal Buddhist belief. The universe is full of life, full of consciousness. And that consciousness is not all like our consciousness. You can believe this or not, but it is what the tradition teaches. And these different kinds of consciousness exist on different planes of refinement. Some of them are much more gross than our own kind, particularly those that are, as it were, more demonic, more related to, I suppose, sort of hellish states and so forth. Some of them are much more refined, much more blissful. And they're arranged traditionally hierarchically. There's a whole schema of these dimensions. And different dimensions have different beings corresponding to them. But the dimensions are dimensions of consciousness. Because human consciousness is so labile, it's flexible, we're able to experience those different realms. That's what will happen if we get deeply into meditation. If you haven't meditated much, you may not really relate to what I'm talking about, but I think probably most people have had some experience of different dimensions of awareness, even if it's only through the ingestion of certain substances. Certainly one of my strongest experiences. But these are taken completely for granted in the Buddhist tradition. They're universally accepted. Buddhism is, if you like, to that extent, an animist religion. It sees the world as peopled, not just by people, but by all sorts of conscious entities, all of which are impermanent, just like us. They're born and they die. Indeed, it's said that we ourselves could be reborn in any of these different states and endure in that state for a while until the force that generates it, the karma that generates it runs out. And then we return to another state. So please, just for the time being, go with this. The Buddhist tradition accepts there's a multiplicity of different kinds of existence with different consciousnesses within those realms. So the Brahmas are a particular kind of God, you could say. Angel may be a better word from the Western tradition. Angelic being, divine being, in the sense of higher than our own. Not transcendental, they're not Buddhas, they're still within mundane existence. But the Brahmas are a kind of being who live or have a consciousness that corresponds to higher states of meditation. States that you yourself probably can and probably will experience if you meditate for any length of time. The states which we refer to as dhyana or jhana, absorption, where after you've been meditating for some time, you're able to concentrate your mind and, as it were, leave the sense world behind. It's not that it's not there, but it goes right to the periphery of your experience, so that you're fully awake and aware, but you're not, as it were, aware through the physical senses. You're aware through an inner sense, through consciousness itself. And these states are extremely satisfying. There's a sense of peace, a tranquility, of great happiness, of joy, even of bliss in these early stages of these experiences, which are within our grasp. If you keep trying and go into the right conditions, you can have these experiences. They're not supernatural or something like that, and not something you just read about in books. You can actually experience them. So in these states, you experience yourself completely differently. You could say, in a certain sense, you no longer experience yourself as yourself in the ordinary way. Your identity, you could say, is changed, is almost dropped, you could say. You no longer experience yourself in terms of polarities. We live in so many polarities. Topically, there's a polarity of race. You no longer experience yourself as white or whatever. You just experience awareness without any sort of frame for it, any identity for it. And of course, above all, you do not experience yourself in terms of the most basic, fundamental polarity that there is, male and female. You do not experience yourself as male or female. And you do not, therefore, experience the tension that goes with an identity as a male or a female. Any sort of polarized identity is a tension. And you experience yourself, at least temporarily, completely free from all polarity. There's just still a tiny little sort of quiver of polarity, but it's very, very subtle, and it's internal. It's a polarity between, as it were, subject and object, but not object external to your immediate experience, not in as it were, objective world, but at the objective pole of your own immediate consciousness. There's still that polarity there. But all the polarities that belong to the world of the senses, you've temporarily suspended. They've not gone completely, because when you come back down, they'll be there again. But for the duration of your experience in the meditation, you're not a man or a woman. You're not English or German or French or black or white or whatever. You no longer have as it were, material identity, at least for the period of that meditation. And of course, you come down from it, and there are all the polarities. And sometimes, if you do go on retreat and you have a deep experience of this, the return to polarity can be a shock and even unpleasant, to be embedded in that sort of polarized world that is the nature of our world. We don't notice it because it's the way things are. We live in polarities, and we don't notice them, even though they affect us very deeply and cause us a great deal of disturbance in one way or another at various times. So we live for a time free from polarity. We live for a time more like the Buddha. So the effort that we make should be gradually releasing us from those polarities, should be gradually lessening those tensions. It should be leading us to the point at which we can experience ourselves free from all these various kinds of polarity, especially the deepest one of male and female, masculine and feminine. So that, as it were, masculine and feminine are united within us rather than external to us. So everybody who wants to tread a serious Buddhist path needs to be working at this dimension. There are two broad ways of doing it. One way is to get such a deep experience of meditation that you're able to enjoy more or less at will the Brahma state. So you're able to dwell in that state of freedom from polarity at will. Every morning you sit down to meditate and you're there. You're beyond those polarities. So that then affects your whole life, and it affects your attitude to those polarities. You're no longer so identified with being a male or a female or whatever. You're much more loose to these identities within which we embed ourselves, and you experience yourself as much more at ease within. So that's one route. So what the Buddha recommended was that if you are able to have that sort of deep experience of freedom from the polarity, especially the sexual polarity, then you just decide you're going to be chaste. You give up sexual activity. You give up involvement in those polarities, whatever that may mean for your own inclinations and so forth. But you consciously decide to give them up. In our order, that usually comes about when you take a vow of celibacy, vow of Brahmacarya, and you usually get a yellow kesa. So you don't have many of them here, but don't know what that says about us, polarized all over the place. That's one route. Don't worry, there is another route. Don't worry. I saw you all edging towards the door. Now, the other route is a rather an interesting one, and it's not much talked about. I feel a little hesitant about it, so if you see me blushing, forgive me. To set the picture for this, in the Buddhist tradition, I'm not going to go into any details, don't worry, relax. In the Buddhist tradition, these different kinds of gods, as it were, have different ways of engaging, well, you could say sexually. The lower gods do it the way we do it, whatever your choice is in that respect. Normal copulation, you could say. That's the way the lower gods engage. That's what they say. I'm just reporting. I'm not talking from my personal experience. But as you get higher up, the sort of hierarchy of these dimensions of consciousness, sexual polarization is released in more subtle ways. So what the tradition says, it's slightly comical, so please don't laugh too much. But first of all, it's released by holding hands. Then by prolonged gazing. Gaze into his or her eyes. And there's a sort of release of tension. You kind of know what this means. And then a mere glance can release that tension. So what this means is, as it were, sex exists on different levels. And you can, if you can't take the Brahmacharya vow route, then you can work to make your own sex life more and more deva-like. This is what our own teacher advised. If you want to engage in sexual activity, fine, but try to make it more deva-like. So it's less and less crude, less and less gross, and more subtle, so that you're engaging with your partner in a way that is more subtle, where a somewhat higher state of consciousness is involved. So you could say that sex is a very complex business, isn't it? In particular, sexo-romance, let's put it all in a bundle. Very, very complex, and I'm not going to try and analyse it all. But of course, there's a basic instinct. In the case of human beings, that instinct, which is quite innocent in human beings, is manipulated by self-awareness. It becomes part of our self-identity, and part of our sexual fulfillment is to do with that, releasing the tensions of our identification of our ego with a particular pole. So there's that sort of release of tension in that way, that you are, as it were, temporarily experiencing the relaxation of your identification with one pole or another. If you're not heterosexual, you have to work it out in your own way. It works out in whatever the context is. Yes, you experience a momentary release of tension. Anyway, we don't go into details. You know what I mean. There's a point after sexual engagement when you just sort of feel completely relaxed, completely sort of, all tension is gone till it all builds up again. So that's the sort of basic element of sexual engagement. Then, of course, there's a more aesthetic dimension to it, because it's pleasurable. There's the contact of skin with skin. Oh gosh, I'm beginning to blush again. My face is naturally red because of my Irish heritage, but there's an aesthetic dimension to it, and you can focus on that. You can make that stronger. You can bring that to the fore. And then, of course, there's a communicative element. There's two human beings involved in the activity. And there can be more and more of a sense of attunement, of an at-one-ment, at least to some degree. So one can work, even within being sexually active, at making that sex bring you closer and closer to Brahmacarya. I'm not going to lead any classes in this, by the way, so I could probably make a lot of money if I chose to. I don't think I'd be very good at it. So you need to think about it. Sex actually needs to be part of what is transformed. Sexo-romantic relationships need to be transformed. There's so much attachment in romantic relationships, so much fantasy, so much projection, and so much of a sort of mutual contract of, I will ignore your faults if you'll ignore mine, or I will focus on yours if you don't focus on mine. No, forget it. There's sort of all sorts of games that get played, in which our own identity is affirmed by, in some sense, possessing the other person. And that is revealed when he or she dumps you, to use the completely technical Sanskrit term. When they dump you, you realise all the attachment, the fantasy, the projection that had been involved. Strange though, isn't it? The moment when you're dumped, there's both feelings. There's both a feeling of, oh God, the world has ended, and it says, freedom. But we won't go into that anymore. But the fact that one can be so distraught at the ending of a relationship reveals the illusions that are caught up in it, as it were. So we can be working on that, working to be less attached, to be freer. The best way of having a good relationship, sexual relationship, romantic relationship, is if you're individuals. If you're actually not just, in Sangharakshita's terms, two paper bags trying to get inside each other. But that you have an independent life, that you have your own friends, that you have your own interests, and you're much more likely to get along much better the more you have that independent life. So, I'm telling you a very big story, a very big issue in a very few words. But what I'm saying is that if you want to make spiritual progress, if you want to become like the Buddha, you have to work in this area too. Either by just deciding you're not going to go there, because you've got something more satisfying. Again, Bhante Sangharakshita, our teacher, used to say, do not give up the lesser pleasures until you have greater ones. Because if you give up prematurely the lesser pleasures, well, you're going to be frustrated. And that frustration can become damaging to you and to others. Look at the history of the Catholic Church in the modern period. It's serious, isn't it? But you can be working to raise the level of of even your sexual and romantic relationship, so that it's less and less attached, so that sex becomes less and less compulsive, less and less animalistic, more and more deva-like, more godlike, you could say, angelic. Yes, those are the two routes, but you need to be working on them. You can't just be an ordinary person with a standard style sex life, as it were, and be enlightened, despite what YouTube will tell you, despite what people will offer you courses in and so forth. It's an illusion. The Buddha made this absolutely clear. You have to transcend this. You have to experience this state of inner fulfillment in which you do not need some sort of outlet to close that polarization. The pole has become within you, and it's, as it were, harmonized within you. Which doesn't mean you can't enter into positive relations with others, but they're not based on craving or attachment. So that's the first of our strands. Our single-sex communities and activities, not that all communities are single-sex, but they're intended to aid that, because you're not always with your partner, if you choose to have one. You've got very close friendships around you, and you can find your own balance with it. They are generally single-sex because, generally, for most people, being with members of their own sex means a relaxation of the polarization. Of course, it's different if you're gay, but even then, there's a polarization which is more biological, if you like, not to do with your sexual orientation. I'm telling you this, but you can find it out for yourselves. Go on the intensives, experience it for yourselves. See if you believe me or not, or whether you see what I mean or not. I'm sweating just because it's hot, not because I'm embarrassed. We establish those institutions, those communities, and even right livelihood businesses, generally on a single-sex basis. We study generally more intensively on a single-sex basis. Many retreats will be on a single-sex basis, simply for that reason, so that we can stop being so polarized. And then we can learn to overcome that polarization in that environment. Of course, there are complications, there are always complications, aren't there? And it's an expedient that applies for different people in different ways. But most people who try these single-sex activities attest to their definite effect, beneficial effect. So we establish institutions that aid the overcoming of that polarization. They're not perfect. It's certain instability, because if you have a relationship outside the community, there's an inherent instability in that. But it gives you an opportunity, at least for a while, to be a little bit free of that and to experience yourself in a new and different way. You may even find that you begin to experience a sense of inner harmony, which means that you're not so driven towards a sexual or romantic outlet. But these semi-monastic institutions are intended to give a respite from the sex war, if you like, from the tension that goes with polarities, the polarities of sex. And try them. Try out. Go on these intensive retreats. You were offered 3 opportunities. One was a general retreat. It's great. Have a good time. I thoroughly enjoyed my first general retreat. But if you're interested in sort of exploring what I've been talking about, go on either the men's or the women's intensive and see if you can experience anything of what I'm talking about. There's a lot more to say about this, and indeed it's really a whole series of talks in itself. But I've outlined at least the issues, and I invite you to explore this further. If you're interested in looking at this any more, I can point you to a book by our teacher called The 10 Pillars of Buddhism, which is about the 10 precepts that we take at ordination, and especially look at his exploration of the 3rd precept, which goes into this material in a very, very clear and deep way. So if you're interested in taking this a bit further, you could explore that. I can point you in the direction of some other things as well. If you're interested in this hierarchy, as it were, of sexual experience, you can look at the series of talks on the Sutra of Golden Light called Transformation of Self and World, and particularly the 3rd chapter, which is called The Protectors of the Dharma, where Bhante goes into these different levels. So I hope that that's communicated something to you. It's a tricky area, and I'm not looking forward to my post box tomorrow. But I hope that I've communicated reasonably cleanly to you what Buddhism has to say in this area, at least in brief. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the other 4 aspects, which are less embarrassing, and putting it all together. So please do come back, and we'll complete the journey. Thank you very much.